Welcome to FPS, the first person show. Today we're with our guest Mag, who is a senior game designer and has been in the industry for over 20 years. Welcome, Mag.
Oh, hi, thank you. I wouldn't maybe say I've been in the industry for that long, but I have been developing games for that long, so I'll take it.
That is really interesting that you've been developing games for over 20 years now. So, would you kindly give an introduction to yourself and what has your journey been in game development?
Yeah, so to be clear, I started doing game development when I was in elementary school and have been doing it for about 20 years since. So a lot of my early experience was rather rudimentary, as you'd expect from an elementary schooler. But since then, I've just gone from increasingly intense hobbyist work to eventually studying game design for 4 years in, I believe, college or university. I'm not sure what the translation would be. Regardless, I have a bachelor's degree in game design, and after that went on to found an indie game studio with some friends of mine.
Oh, really interesting. Really interesting that you've been developing games for that long. Surely, in an elementary school, getting ahead of all the competition. So, tell us about some of the games you've made in this long time span.
Yes, well, I've had a whole lot of game projects, but unfortunately, for a lot of my younger times, I had some personal issues in the form of undiagnosed ADHD that prevented me from being very good at finishing things. So most of the things I've actually finished and published have happened in the previous 5 or so years. So I think I'm going to skip in that direction. There we could look at the first one that comes to mind is while I was studying, we did with a group of friends for partially a school project, partially on free time, a game called Raid Party, which has a playable demo available on itch. It's this roguelike deck builder card game where you control a group of characters and deal with a lot of very silly, wacky-toned enemies while charging into an island and beating up everyone you run into by throwing random objects at them. And then the other game, the much bigger one that I've been involved in, is on Steam, Gate Delvers, currently in early access, which is a roguelike dungeon crawler with online co-op.
Really interesting that you've worked on many games and some of which you listed here. I do understand that Raid Party did have a little bit of what should be the correct word, some trouble with its names. Could you delve into that what happened and what was the reasoning behind the controversy of the name of the game?
Yes, I'm not sure it really became anything bigger of a controversy than a frustration on the developers' parts, but a few years after we released the Raid Party demo on itch.io, there was this craze of, well, you're probably quite aware, NFTs and NFT-related games. And if you go to Google and look up just Raid Party with nothing else, the first thing that pops up, or at least used to pop up, I'm not entirely sure right now, yes, does seem to still be the one, is a game called Raid Party, Raid.party, which, as far as I can tell, is a blockchain NFT earn by playing game. And having a game you spent a bunch of time working on have its name and spot on Google searches be taken by something like that is a frustrating experience, but not necessarily something where any of us would have interest in starting any trouble about it. So it was kind of just a demotivating thing that pushed us to be less interested in continuing development on that game.
Yes, it is indeed frustrating when mostly with NFT projects, these projects took something that indie developers or small developers had done, and then they took that idea or concept, or even in this case, just the naming rights, and they made their own thing. I don't think that was really a good thing, as we also how the NFT market came to a close. You did mention multiplayer games. As with most beginners, when they start out, they have this grand idea of making an MMORPG or making a multiplayer game which they and their friends could enjoy. And recently, we've been seeing many of these games, such as Peak recently came out, and the genre has been defined as friend swap. While it's not delving into what friend swap actually is, would you explain to our viewers if a multiplayer game is a good direction for when you're starting out, or is there something that you should aim for when you have learned the basics of game development?
I definitely view it as the sort of thing where making games is really complicated. Making multiplayer games is complicated just as a layer on top of that. And it's similar to how, like, you don't necessarily want to start trying to learn a unicycle before you can ride a regular bike or walk. I would really recommend developers finish at least one non-multiplayer project before attempting anything regarding multiplayer. I think the exception to this could be if the person coming into this is coming from like a programmer developer background and knows netcode stuff and knows what they're doing. But even then, I think just in practice, you always want to start with a small, simple project when you're getting started on any method of game development, right?
Yeah, I do agree with that. Developers, I think, should start with something small, something playable, something that you could make to understand the basics of everything. And I really like the analogy of the unicycle and a skateboard. You need to start with something that is easier, something with training wheels on, before you can take on those larger projects.
Yeah, although I can't go and blame anyone for trying to jump into the big dream game right away, even though that is objectively a bad idea. But I don't think anyone can, because pretty much all of us did it at one point. It's easier to get excited for the big grand idea you had flying in your brain than get excited about remaking Pong for practice.
Exactly. I am way too familiar with this, as I personally spent like 6 months working on an MMORPG open world, infinitely replayable game, and after 6 months, I had a furnace, one furnace, and it was the only thing in the game. You could walk up to the furnace, and that's when I realized that yeah, this is not the way. I need to go and make Flappy Bird first, and then I can come back to this. So that is a really good analogy of working on smaller games and then working on your dream projects.
Yeah, I think you absolutely have the right idea. And in general, with like both talking to friends, I have a lot of friends who work on various games, and doing all of my own projects for a pretty long time now. One of the things I feel like I've increasingly been learning is that focus is so important. Even if you're going to increase the scope of your game, it's dramatically easier to make a coherent, fun game and figure out where to cut scope and how to get it finished if you have a central core thing idea of what you're doing, instead of doing like 5 ideas at once.
That is really good advice. I think most beginner developers get lost in what they should be prioritizing, and they get into this sort of mess where alright, they've got all these ideas in front of them and not a clear path of how they should tackle each of those ideas. And sometimes it's just best to get 1 or 2 ideas in a more clear sense rather than having 5 or 6 half-baked ideas into your game.
Yeah, exactly. Like the best developers and the most successful developers I know, like personally, tend to be the ones who have decided on a game, on one specific thing they're going to do really, really well, and then just fully committed to that, and then added some things around it afterwards as they go. But they've always had that core of what that game is about. And that makes both the game really, like, it makes the game much easier to sell if you're trying to go commercial, because it's much easier to convince people on a game where there's an obvious central selling point than a game where it's like, oh, in this game you can do smithing and crafting, and also you can go skateboarding, and there's a racing game and online multiplayer, and you get points for doing backflips. It's the sort of, all right, I'm not entirely sure what I'm being sold here.
Yeah, I think we saw this recently with what's the game, Mind's Eye, where they tried selling everything and then the game was nothing and incomplete. So yeah, I think again this point of focusing on one thing is really important. What are your specialties in game development? What do you really prize yourself on? What mechanics do you think that these are something that you really can do perfectly?
I am personally a huge fan of randomness in games, specifically using randomness because I enjoy games that let you build mastery in systems, like starting to understand interactions, synergies, how different things work together, and how you can take advantage of those. But often by default, games will end up things and can repeat them at like as high of an effectiveness as possible. I don't really enjoy memorization-based gameplay, so I'm much more favorable towards games that use randomness to some extent to like make you focus more on improvising in unique novel situations than doing the same exact situations repeatedly. If you want to look at my other specialty, I think multiplayer counts as a specialty just on the basis of I can do it, because most developers don't do it.
Yes, most developers don't really do multiplayer. Going back to that topic of randomness, I think most players do enjoy coming across new situations in a game which they've already played multiple times. If it gives a game that feeling of endless content and replayability. I think Enter the Gungeon does that really nicely with all of its guns and layouts, where each run would feel unique, even though you could do thousands of runs and still end up having a unique or new run after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Enter the Gungeon also, I think, does demonstrate something that's important about this topic, which is that, because often people do also view like procedural level generation and random items and such sort as something of a silver bullet for content generation. But Enter the Gungeon, I think, is a good example of the fact that it has a ton of randomness in there, what guns you find and what rooms you find. But you might also notice that the guns aren't actually random, the rooms aren't random. That game has a massive amount of handmade content. It's not trying to really create content with randomness, it's shuffling the content around so you get different combinations of it, but they've still put a ton of work into actually making things interesting, because randomness isn't good at making things humans find interesting. Humans are.
That's a very interesting analogy. Yes, Enter the Gungeon does have handcrafted rooms, and I think that adds to the charm of the game, where these rooms are really designed and laid out perfectly. Going back to that initial question of randomness, what is randomness in computer games? Because time and time again we're told that random computers cannot generate random numbers. So with the randomness being a specialty of yours, what do you think is randomness, and what do you think if we can achieve true randomness? Because often in games that implement random stuff, such as for example Pokemon, does have random stuff, but players have figured out calculators and stuff and other sort of ways to bypass that randomness and get exactly what they want. So my question to you is, again, what is randomness, and if computers can achieve true randomness?
From my perspective, as a game designer, game developer, and someone who cares about psychology a lot more than necessarily math and technology in this case, my perspective is randomness is anything that players, or outside of the context of games, people cannot reasonably predict, right? And for that purpose, computer-generated random numbers are, in fact, true randomness, as long as the method they're being generated is like evenly random and does not have any exploitable issues that lets people manipulate it. So yeah, that's a good example that it stops being functional randomness the moment you're dealing with like an emulator where people know tricks to force the randomness to do something specific. But for most people playing most games, it might as well be true randomness, so it doesn't really matter.
It is an interesting answer, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general it comes down to the fact that when I'm interacting with, like, when I'm designing a game, when I'm dealing with games in general, there's like a few layers to the game, right? There's the player, there's the game itself, and then there's the experience you're trying to create. As a designer, as a game designer, the main goal is to figure out how to make the game and the rules within the game create the experience you want to make. So you decide what experience you want, then you make the game's rules after that. And that means that the only thing I really care about in most pieces of like technology used for games is whether they can do the things necessary to make the rules work, right?
What is the difference between a game developer and a game designer?
Yes, if you don't mind me asking a clarifying question here, when you say game developer, do you mean a programmer, someone who writes code for games, or just the other definition of anyone who develops games?
I'd say for this question specifically, I'd be guessing that it's the game developer who codes the game and goes off a list of requirements what the designer has laid out.
Right, yeah. Well, in practice, the difference, I think, actually goes well into that whole idea of the game being a sort of machine between the player and the experience the designer's trying to create. It's the designer's job to figure out how to make the rules and systems and how the game should work so that you can get the experience you want for the player, while the programmer has the job of making that machine, the thing in the middle that the player interacts with, actually work and do the things it's supposed to. Like, I feel like a good example would be the person who figures out what kind of building should be built and like does the architectural thing of how to make it a good experience for people to use that building, compared to the person who looks at the building, figures out if it's going to fall over, and then builds it.
That's a great example. So what do you think is the most important aspect of a game designer? Like, what's the first thing when designing a game you look at? Is it game centric? Does it differ from game to game? And what is the universal tips or suggestions you would give to new developers or new game designers in general?
That's spicy. Good question. Let me think for a moment. Because there's definitely a few answers for this. I don't think there is a magic silver bullet. I think in general, a big one is, I guess I'm going back to the whole experience and game thing again. Often with new developers, you find that they get really attached to the game part of the game and kind of at the expense of the experience they're trying to create. They get excited about a specific mechanic or system or rule, right, that they find cool or interesting. They get attached to it. And then in playtesting, they find out that the experience of the game isn't really working, that rule's not doing its job, but they're more attached to the rule than the experience that the game provides. So I guess the big picture here I'm trying to get at is that the game is a device for creating an experience. So if part of the game isn't working for creating the experience you want, you need to just kind of be willing to kill your babies in the metaphorical sense here, because I've had so many cases. I literally had it earlier today where I have a system that I think is conceptually really cool, but it forces the player to think too much about a part of the game that's not the point for the experience. Like I have a strategy game where you want to make decisions and try to predict your opponent and figure out what you're going to do. And there's an initiative system, and I figured out a way to make the initiative system very cool and interesting. I quickly found that that just means players thinking more about the initiative system than the cool battling and trying to figure out what their opponent's going to do. Playtest a lot, figure out what kind of experience you're trying to make, and ensure that that's what the game is actually creating.
Yeah, I think most new designers or developers get stuck in that loop where they don't really get any external feedback to their games. And as a developer, it's really easy to understand your own mechanics and systems and rules. But to an outsider, it may not be that simple looking at what the designer or the developer wants you to do at that section. So yes, playtesting frequently and getting external feedback frequently is really important for game development and game design.
Absolutely. And the fact is, I've been doing this for a long time, and still, every time I've carefully designed a system and a game, and I got it to a playable state, and I first time go to offer it to a player to test it, it usually takes 20 seconds until they do something and I go, oh, right, yeah, I didn't think of that, huh. So it's just, it doesn't matter how good or new or experienced you are, as soon as possible, make your game playable, show it to people. I understand, I think every game developer understands that getting people to playtest your early development game is a whole challenge.
Exactly, and part of being a developer is getting to face these random questions when you are getting early feedback for your game, and people would ask, hey, why doesn't this have texture? Hey, why can I walk out of bounds? Hey, why is the map not finished? And most people don't realize that all the effort that goes into designing and developing a game and the time it takes to develop a game.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely always the sort of because it would be great if we all had perfect playtesters that can tell what's finished and what isn't, but that's not the reality we live in, so you do always just have to kind of go, oh yeah, just pretend all the walls aren't white boxes and the world isn't made of cubes and such. That's not really what I'm testing here, but it can be difficult, especially with the sort of because when you're doing playtesting, you don't want to intervene. You want to stay out of it as much as possible so you get the experience of someone playing without a designer sitting behind them, and that can be very painful.
I think a good benchmark for if your game does convey the message is if you don't have to tell the player every 5 seconds that you should be going left, oh no, you should be going right, oh no, this was supposed to be solved this way. At that point, you need to think that all right, this message isn't being conveyed really efficiently, and you need to go back to the drawing board at that point.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually just a practical playtesting hint, which is that if you have the possibility, if you have people who are willing to do this, the best way to playtest is to have them record themselves when you're not there and send you the video, because that means you can't ruin your own playtest by telling them what to do, and you get to watch there, looking at them fail to open a door for 10 minutes straight, at which point you'll probably have gotten the message and you should probably fix that door.
Exactly. Watching a playlist run around like headless chicken is always a delight.
Yeah, it's the sort of like something feels entirely obvious to you, and then you do several playtests and not a single player gets it, and you're like, all right, maybe I need to re-examine my biases a little.
What do you mean? The block that looks like all the other blocks is a door, which isn't textured.
Yeah, and all the sorts of things where you like develop a term for a concept or such sort while developing and kind of end up forgetting that players don't exist in the same world as you in this regard. Like they don't know the idea, they don't know the intent, they're just going by what's on their screen. And sometimes the order in which things get introduced makes no sense.
At a steady and digestible way. I guess we can pause this episode right here. Then we can do a part 2 of this a week or two from now. How does that sound?
Sounds good to me.
Perfect, perfect. Alright, we'll just leave the raid party link in the description for people to try out.
Maybe put Gate Delvers if you're gonna put something. That game is definitely newer and better made.
Alright, sure. So that was Mag, everyone. And that concludes episode 3 of FPS. Tune on in next week and subscribe and follow along.